I'm Billie West, Director of Labor Relations and co-chair of Merakey's Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council. On behalf of the Council, it is my honor to welcome you to our annual celebration of Black History Month. This presentation is entitled Peace and Empowerment, Students of the Movement. It is designed to share moments in history of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and the Civil Rights Movement in America, and highlight the contributions of children, teenagers, and young people, all students who, in spite of harsh and in some cases unbearable conditions, dedicated and sacrificed themselves to a cause to end injustice, to fight for the respect, dignity, and equal rights of all persons. Their commitment to uphold human dignity ultimately made a difference in their lives and opened up the possibility of a more just world for future generations through their acts of peace and with empowerment. Here's an old picture from a family photo album of my father, Wesley Anthony Brown, and my sister Carol and me. A year before I was born, my father did something monumental that would change American history, military history, and Black history. He consciously broke the color barrier, integrating an all-white institution in 1945 in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement, and became the first African-American graduate of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. His achievement was accomplished in spite of the racial prejudice and acts of discrimination mounted against him as the only Black midshipman student to try to make him fail. He succeeded because others believed in him and encouraged him through their concern and friendship, like President Jimmy Carter, who was his classmate, and because he believed in himself and wanted to fulfill his dreams to be a naval officer. I was very proud of my dad, but it was difficult at times for our family, especially when we would travel with him from one military base to another for his deployments. In the 1950s and 60s, because of what were then called Jim Crow laws, they allowed Black people to be treated like second-class citizens. We slept in bags in our car, unable to get rooms in hotels, drove long distances because gas station owners would not sell us gas, would eat in parks outdoors because we would not be served meals in restaurants. And worse, sometimes the children who attended all-white schools with us did not want to play or study because we were Black. They would snicker and call us names. All they saw was the color of our skin, thought we were inferior to them, and they did not want us to get an education like theirs, yet alone get to know who we were as human beings. I learned at an early age, through the example set for me by my dad, to try to see the good in others, follow the golden rule, and to face difficulty in peaceful ways while being empowered to make changes that would uplift and promote diversity and inclusion. In the recent United States history, there were state and local laws passed that enforced racial segregation in the South. And it started between the end of the period known as Reconstruction, which followed the Civil War in 1877, and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, which grew in the 1950s. Prior to the Civil War, the inferior status of slaves made it unnecessary to pass laws segregating them from white people. But then a uniform pattern emerged after the war. It extended to the North, where free Blacks lived under harsh restrictions, some more rigid than segregation in the South. Jim Crow laws prohibited Blacks from using public facilities that were used by whites, including streetcars, buses, trains, drinking fountains, movies, pools, parks, churches, and schools. Blacks were forced to use what were termed separate but equal facilities, but these were inferior, in poor condition, and were often non-existent. Claudette Colvin was a pioneer of the 1950 Civil Rights Movement. On March 2, 1955, she was arrested at the age of 15 in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a crowded, segregated bus on her way home from a Black school. This occurred 9 months before the more widely known incident in which Rosa Parks secretary of the local chapter of the NAACP, helped spark the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. Claudette became belligerent, demanding her constitutional rights, and her arrest by the police and her treatment was humiliating and degrading. She was one of 5 plaintiffs in a first federal court case filed in 1956 over bus segregation. She testified before the 3-judge panel, and in 1956, in December, the Supreme Court affirmed the order that Montgomery and the state of Alabama were to end bus segregation, and the year-long Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Claudette and Rosa Parks, was called off. For many years, Montgomery Black leaders did not publicize Claudette's pioneering effort. She was an unmarried teenager at the time, but she retired as a nurse aide after 35 years of dedication to her profession. And amazingly, Claudette just received a congressional citation in 2018 to commemorate her heroism back in 1955. Claudette often said she was not angry that she did not get more recognition, rather she was disappointed. The tension between blacks and whites was enormous, and organizations were formed to help end Jim Crow. One of those organizations was the National Association of the Advancement for Colored People. This was established in 1909 as a biracial endeavor to advance justice and to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic rights of all persons, and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. The NAACP efforts included political lobbying, publicity efforts, and litigation strategies developed by its legal team to win social justice for African Americans and for all Americans, especially children, whose equal access to education was considered paramount then and for future generations. In 1954, in a case before the Supreme Court by the NAACP legal defense, the court declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, and by extension, that ruling was applied to other public facilities. In the years following, subsequent decisions struck down similar kinds of Jim Crow legislation, including the public accommodations, housing. This is where blacks were barred from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods, employment, and voting. The Brown decision helped propel the momentum necessary and further raise the level of the civil rights movement that had been initiated by Southern blacks in the 1950s. It inspired even more marches and demonstrations. But the ruling did not end the problem of segregation in public schools, and many schools refused to adhere to the laws of the land. A series of critical events followed. For example, a relatively unknown story in the annals of the civil rights movement came from a small town in Tennessee. For over 10 years, the African American community of Clinton, Tennessee, struggled with racism and discriminatory practices, highlighted following World War II, when many black men returned from service to their country to servitude in their hometowns. The African American community began filing a series of lawsuits to force integration and equal facilities beginning in 1947. And so following the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, a federal judge ordered the Clinton High School to desegregate in all deliberate speed. The integration of Clinton High School was forced to be the first among Tennessee public schools. Anti-integration campaigners from inside and outside Clinton protested the decision to integrate the high school. The 12 black students who attended Clinton High School that fall became known as the Clinton 12. And on the morning of each school day, they walked together down Broad Street from Foley Hill. And on the morning of December 4th, 1956, Reverend Paul Turner, a white minister of the First Baptist Church, was severely beaten after escorting the 12 students to school. Early in the morning of October 5th, 1958, the high school building was severely damaged by a series of dynamite explosions. An estimated 75 to 100 sticks of dynamite had been placed throughout the building. No one was injured, but the school officials estimated damages at $300,000. and so Clinton was once again the focus of attention over a crime that universally assumed to be related to the desegregation. A bronze statue of the Clinton 12 is now displayed outside the entrance to the Green McAdoo School, named for a U.S. Army veteran who had been one of the famed Buffalo Soldiers. And this is where the 12 students had originally attended their elementary school. Yet in another challenge, in 1959, Prince Edward County, Virginia, closed the public schools rather than give in to court-ordered desegregation. They received a massive resistance to this flagrant disregard for the law of the land. And so together with the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the Southern Regional Council, dozens of students were placed with host families in school districts throughout the county. In 1963, a free school in Prince Edward County was established where integrated faculty taught 1,500 African Americans and 6 white children. And so here you had, from 1959 to 1964, Black students in Prince Edward County who had to go to school elsewhere or forego their education altogether. The struggle to integrate public schools continued with the Little Rock Nine, a group of African American students enrolled in Little Rock Central High School. In 1957, they were initially prevented from entering the racially segregated school by the governor of Arkansas. They then attended after the intervention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Claiming that Little Rock had their right to assert freedom against federal decisions, the governor signed acts that enabled him and the school district to close all public schools and open private ones. The city's teachers were also placed in a difficult position along with their students. They were forced to swear loyalty to the governor's bills. His idea of private schools never played out, and the teachers were still expected to attend school every day and prepare for the possibility of their students' return. The students were completely under the governor's control, and for the many months that ensued, the schools stayed empty and only served as a cause for uncertainty in their professional futures. And for Black students, an entire year was lost. In May of 1959, after the firing of 44 teachers, the segregationists were replaced with moderates, and board members reinstated the 44 staff into their previous positions. They began to attempt to reopen the schools, much to the governor's dismay. In order to avoid any further complications, the public schools opened earlier than usual. But after that lost year had come to the close, the Black students who returned to those high schools were not welcomed by other students. They had a difficult time getting past mobs to enter the school, and once inside, they were subject to physical and emotional abuse. The students were back at school, and everything would eventually resume to normal function, but the lost year would be a pretext for new hatred among Black students in public high schools. Also in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King and 60 ministers met in Atlanta, Georgia, to develop a civil rights strategy on a larger scale that would involve people from all walks of life, Black and white, young and old. The movement was inspired using Christian values, but more needed to be done, and Martin Luther King and others turned to Mahatma Gandhi to adopt his nonviolence philosophy and practices. In 1959, Dr. King and his wife, Coretta, visited India to learn firsthand the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. These principles became an integral part of the method that would be used repeatedly and consistently during the movement. Students readily embraced the philosophy and were trained by Black leaders in these tactics of passive resistance. Their leaders sought to prepare them for the potential physical and emotional harm that awaited them with peaceful protests. Dr. King would later describe how, quote, Negroes of the United States following the people of India have demonstrated that nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. The foundation of such a method is love, end quote. Ruby Neal Bridges was the first African American child to desegregate the all-white France Elementary School in Louisiana in 1960. Ruby's parents responded to the NAACP when asked for volunteers to participate in the integration of the New Orleans school system. Her father was reluctant, but her mother felt strongly not only to give her daughter a better education, but to, quote, take this step forward for all African American children, end quote. Her mother finally convinced her father to let her go to school. On the first day, Ruby was met by a mob of well-dressed, upstanding housewives. They were shouting awful obscenities, so profane that it was reported that the audio from the scene had to be masked in television coverage. Ruby had to be escorted past this offensiveness by federal marshals. She showed courage, never cried, didn't whimper. She marched like a little soldier, and all were very proud of her. And as soon as she entered the school, white parents pulled their own children out. All of them, except one, refused to teach, while a black child was enrolled in the same school. And on the second day, a white student broke the boycott. 5-year-old Pam, daughter of a Methodist minister, also walked through the angry mob. Her dad said, I simply want the privilege of taking my child to school. However, Ruby's family suffered at this peaceful act of nonviolence. Her father lost his job as a gas station attendant. Her grandparents, who were sharecroppers in Mississippi, lost the farm they had worked their entire life, and her parents separated. White families continued to send their children to France despite protests. A neighbor provided her father with a new job. Locals babysat her younger siblings while her mother accompanied her. Others watched the house as protectors. Eventually, the controversy subsided. Ruby became the subject of a 1964 painting, The Problem We All Live With, by renowned artist Norman Rockwell. Considered an iconic image of the civil rights movement, it was viewed by millions all over the world when it first appeared as a centerfold in Look magazine. Rockwell used this image to express his views on social interests, political themes, the civil rights movement, and the racial integration. It was one of the first paintings that announced not only the violence of segregation, but how a great many people were violently opposed to the issue of desegregation. And if you'll notice on the painting, the red of the thrown tomato, the racial slur with the N-word, and KKK on the wall. To protest racial segregation, in February 1960, 4 African-American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a Woolworth's designated whites-only drugstore lunch counter without being served. The Greensboro Four said they were inspired by the nonviolent protests of Gandhi, and the Greensboro sit-ins sparked similar sit-ins throughout the city and other states. By February, 300 students had joined the protest at Woolworth's, paralyzing the lunch counter and other local businesses, and there was heavy television coverage of the sit-ins. This sit-in movement spread quickly to college towns throughout the South and into the North, as young blacks and whites joined in various forms of peaceful protest against segregation in libraries, beaches, hotels, and other establishments. By the end of March, a month later, the movement had spread to an incredible 55 cities in 13 states. And though many of the protesters were arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, or disturbing the peace, the actions of these 4 young black college students from North Carolina A&T made an immediate and lasting impact. It forced Woolworths and other establishments to change their policies. From 1947 through 1961, black and white student activists known as Freedom Riders took bus trips through the American South to protest segregated bus terminals and attempted to use whites-only restrooms and lunch counters. The Freedom Riders were marked by horrific violence from white protesters that drew international attention to their cause. The civil rights strategy was developed by a number of organizations, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In addition, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was the principal channel of student commitment in the United States to the civil rights movement during the 1960s. SNCC is credited in its brief existence with breaking down barriers, both institutional and psychological, to the empowerment of African American communities, and it was also seen as offering subsequent social and political movement templates for grassroots organizing and consistent with the vision of the committee's early mentor, Ella Baker, for the broad and creative participation of women. Ella Josephine Baker was an African American civil rights and human rights activist who worked tirelessly, largely as a behind-the-scenes organizer, whose career spanned more than 5 decades. In New York City and the South, she worked alongside some of the most noted civil rights leaders of the 20th century, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, A. Philip Randolph, and Martin Luther King Jr. She also mentored many emerging activists. Baker criticized professionalized, charismatic leadership. She promoted grassroots organizing and the ability of the oppressed to understand their worlds and advocate for themselves. Baker has been ranked as one of the most important African American leaders of the 20th century and perhaps the most influential woman in the civil rights movement. She is also known for her critiques not only of racism within American culture, but also of sexism within the civil rights movement. These pictures demonstrate the foundation of the Christian values that Dr. Martin Luther King and the students who were involved in the movement held. These beliefs were deep, and Martin Luther King described his inner urge to serve humanity. They prayed for courage, prayed for their enemies, prayed for a way out of no way, and thank God for their victories. The photo on your right shows John Lewis, a student kneeling in prayer. John would go on to become a congressman and would fight for civil rights his entire life. Martin Luther King was arrested numerous times, and this is a photograph of one that occurred while he was in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King was jailed along with large numbers of his supporters. The event drew nationwide attention. Dr. King was personally criticized by white clergy for taking risks and endangering children who attended demonstrations. They asked Dr. King, "Why are you here in Birmingham?" To which he responded, "I am here because injustice is here." In a famous letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. King further spelled out his theory of nonviolence. He wrote that the teachings of Jesus provided for the nonviolent activities that were solely intended to correct injustices. The Birmingham Children's Crusade was launched in the first week in May of 1963. The civil rights movement for these children was already an integral part of their lives. They had witnessed their parents' involvement through mass meetings in their churches, and they wanted to be a part of the change. Many parents and civil rights leaders were cautious about involving young people in the protests. But as it turned out, the brave actions of these children helped make lasting change in Birmingham and became a key turning point in the movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, as well as other groups, developed plans to desegregate Birmingham, notorious for discriminatory practices in employment and public life, and the use of nonviolent protest tactics. They believed civic and business leaders would agree to desegregate. And so Martin Luther King and the religious leaders of Birmingham led thousands of African Americans. The campaign that involved children resulted in mass arrests. James Bevel, a chief strategist for SNCC, along with Ella Baker, enacted plans for the Children's Crusade. Thousands of children were trained in the tactics of nonviolence and were prepared by these and other Black leaders, as well as their families, for what awaited them. Met with fierce resistance and violence by Birmingham police, fire hoses, and German Shepherd attack dogs. Millions around the country and the world were devastated, shocked, and appalled at the violence these children endured. And despite the harsh treatment, children continued to volunteer to participate in the demonstration for days. Children were held in overcrowded jails. They sang protest songs and continued their tactics. And on May 10th, an agreement between civic and civil rights leaders was reached to free all of those who had been jailed. Weeks later, the Birmingham Board of Education announced that all students who had been involved in the Children's Crusade would be expelled, and the decision was ultimately overturned by a court of appeals. The city was in the world spotlight, and local officials knew they could no longer ignore the civil rights movement. The Children's Crusade marked a significant victory in Birmingham, but yet the struggle for equality and justice continued. Thousands of children, some of them as young as 7 or 8 years old, had kept the momentum of the struggle in its most pivotal hour. Peace and empowerment were evident. In 1963, at the University of Alabama, Governor George Wallace blocked the entrance to the college, refusing to admit 2 Black students, James Hood and Vivian Malone. President John Kennedy ordered their admission, and later that evening he would deliver a civil rights address to the nation from the White House. He said, "My fellow citizens, this afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required to carry out the final order of the United States District Court. The order called for the admission of 2 clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro." And he said, "I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds, and it was founded on the principle that all men are created equal and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened." Finally, he said, "This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here have an equal chance to develop their talent. I think we owe them, and we owe ourselves, a better country than this." On August 28, 1968, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was held on the National Mall, where over 250,000 participated. This march marked the centennial, or the 100th anniversary, of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. It also marked the success of the Birmingham campaign and mass movements and demonstrations throughout the United States. And during the march, these demands were made: the desegregation of all schools, economic justice, equal access to facilities and accommodations, housing, education, and jobs. Dr. King delivered the closing address in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he stated, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." This was the catalyst to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Protests and demonstrations were not germane to the South. The Chicago Public Schools boycott, also known as Freedom Day, was a mass boycott against the segregationist policies of the Chicago Public Schools held on October 22, 1963. More than 200,000 students stayed out of school, and tens of thousands of Chicagoans joined in that protest that culminated in a march to the office of the Chicago Board of Education. School boundary lines were drawn specifically to preserve racial segregation, even as predominantly black schools grew overcrowded. Their classes were held in hallways. There were not enough books for the students. Some schools held double shifts, meaning students attended less than a full day of class. And rather than send black students to underpopulated white schools, the superintendent, Benjamin Willis, instituted the use of mobile classrooms. 625 aluminum trailers were parked in parking lots and playgrounds of overcrowded schools. The Willis wagons was a term coined to describe the mobile classrooms. And at one high school, these trailers were used to maintain segregation within the school. Black students' classes were held in Willis wagons, while white students went to class inside the school. In February of 1964, a similar demonstration was held in New York City. Organized by Bayard Rustin, an African-American from Westchester, Pennsylvania, raised a Quaker. He was a staunch gay rights activist, union organizer, and the unknown chief strategist of the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as the March on Washington. He organized a one-day protest against segregationist school board policies in New York, which involved almost half of the student body in the city. The response was overwhelming. 450,000 Black and Latino students engaged in the boycott and refused to attend their respective schools. And despite enjoying broad support, the boycott failed to force the city's school board to undertake immediate reform. These pictures depict Martin Luther King and his family. He loved them. He loved his children, and he was devoted to them. They inspired him to continue the struggle, to travel from one end of the country to the other, to be jailed, to be criticized. His children were foremost in his mind. This photo shows Dr. King, the father, buckling the shoe of his young daughter. It is symbolic of the step forward taken by Ruby Bridges, supported and encouraged by family and extended family. Dr. King dreamed of a better future for his children, Yolanda, Martin III, Dexter, and Bernice, as well as all children of the world. Dr. King's son, Martin III, a human rights and civil rights activist to this day, focuses on what his father once called triple evils. They were poverty, racism, and militarism. In a recent interview, he said, "I think the culture of nonviolence will help create the conditions where poverty is unacceptable, where racism is way behind us and not something we have to deal with, and where militarism and violence are reduced almost to be non-existent." The rising tide of the civil rights agitation culminated in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which contains strong provisions against discrimination and segregation in voting, education, and use of public facilities. This picture shows President Lyndon Johnson, along with Dr. Martin Luther King in the background, as he signs this law, which also prevents employment discrimination due to race, color, religion, or national origin. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was awarded this for his dynamic leadership of the civil rights movement and his steadfast commitment to achieving racial justice through nonviolent action. In his acceptance speech delivered in Oslo, Norway on December 10th, he said, "I accept this award on behalf of a civil rights movement which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger, to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice. He went on to say, "I am mindful that only yesterday in Birmingham, Alabama, our children, crying out for brotherhood, were answered by violence." He concluded, "Sooner or later, we will discover a way to live together in peace. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." Seeds sown in the civil rights movement flourished as students in peace and with empowerment took up even more challenges. Their activism changed government policy and, perhaps more importantly, changed how almost every American lives today. Anti-Vietnam War movement, gay rights, women's rights, the environmental concerns, free speech, the uprising against apartheid, farm workers movement, social change, Black power. Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In closing, we invite you to symbolically join hands in celebration of the contributions of the students of the civil rights movement to Black history through peace and empowerment.